Hello and welcome. My name is Sara Gon and I'm the director of the Free Speech Union of South Africa. I hope this may be the first in a series on all issues to do with the freedom of speech, or lack thereof, or threat thereto in South Africa and possibly elsewhere. Freedom of speech is a constitutional right in this country, and I'd regard it as foundational to our enjoyment of all other rights. However, as I think Ronald Reagan said, freedom is a fragile thing and is never more than a generation away from extinction. Now, the topic of today's podcast is a discussion of a recent and comprehensive report which reviews freedom of expression in South Africa from 2018 to 2023. The report is entitled "The Landscape is Darkening," and it was compiled by Alan Finlay, independent researcher on media and internet rights, on behalf of the Campaign for Free Expression. And to that extent, I would like to welcome both Anton Harber, the executive of the campaign, and Alan Finlay himself. Gentlemen, welcome to today's discussion.
Thank you.
Anton, can I start perhaps by asking you why now, and what brought the issue to the point where you felt a report on the state of free speech, which I think we've almost learned to take for granted in South Africa? We're certainly noisy about it. What led you to commission a report?
Certainly, my organization, our organization, Campaign for Free Expression, is an advocacy organization dedicated to protecting and expanding our rights to free expression. And let me say, we find that a lot of South Africans and South Africa watchers take the view that, what is this about? South Africa is a great deal of free expression. You make a lot of noise. You say a debate in South Africa is rich and sometimes quite rough. So why are you worried about free expression? And as you've indicated, we worry about free expression because, as this report highlights, so one purpose of this report was to highlight the fact that while we have a great deal of free expression, which we must celebrate, there are a number of red flags flying about threats to free expression, which we also have to pay attention to. Another reason was that, a lot of our work we want to base on facts and research, and this provides a basis for us. It points us to issues affecting free expression that we might not have looked at unless we did this kind of research. And I want to say it's a very fine piece of work. So I'm grateful to you for giving it greater exposure.
Anton, before going on to Alan, can I ask you why particularly the period 2018 to 2023, essentially the era of President Cyril Ramaphosa?
We plan to do a version of this every year to focus on that year. But we thought for our first one, there was some catching up to do. And the period of the Ramaphosa presidency seemed to us to provide a good framework to set the basis, which we hope to update each year going forward. And by the way, this year, we're doing it in 5 Southern African countries.
Okay, well, there's scope for further discussion, clearly. Alan, the subjects dealt with are in a larger range, perhaps, than I or others would instinctively consider. We would look at the media who come to mind. We would look at legislative support or prescriptions on free speech. But there are other issues that wouldn't necessarily be ones we would associate with. And I think this creates a particular area of interest, such as the issue of the effect of gender, assassinations, things like that. The issues that we tend to see within the broader society, but wouldn't necessarily automatically drill down to affecting our free speech. How did you sort of go about putting those together and coming up with something that is unexpected in some ways?
I mean, you're right. I mean, first of all, it was the original brief and idea of the Campaign for Free Expression and Anton to provide something much more holistic and broader than the typical focus on media freedoms, which is quite commonly what freedom of expression reports do. It'd be media freedoms, it might be internet freedoms, and legislation would be that sort of basket. But Anton wanted something broader that tried to describe, in a sense, the temperament of free expression in South Africa in a much broader scale. I mean, the premise is that freedom of expression underpins so many other rights. Okay, so there is an idea that, although this wasn't necessarily the intention, but if you trace freedom of expression, it's also a bit of a litmus test for what's going on in terms of other rights, because if that's being curtailed in various ways, well, you can assume that the various other rights are also being affected in some way. And there are limitations. I mean, obviously, to do something really entirely comprehensive is what's probably lifelong work in a sense, because I mean, there's freedom of expression in religion, freedom of expression in prisons of migrants, the education sector, which I believe Anton has commissioned someone to do some work on that. So anyway, the broad scope to move out of the narrow confines of some kind of index-based report on freedom of expression was the intention.
Anton, I think particularly in lead up to the national and provincial election this year, it would make a great deal of sense to look at the sector that is most responsible for communicating to the citizenry what people are saying, what they're doing, what they're promising. And perhaps I can add to that is the fact that my concern with the elections is not that they would be interfered with in terms of the electoral process or the electoral outcome, so much as what happens in the period before the 29th of May. In other words, what people and political parties and political leaders do or do not do leading up to that period. And in that respect, I'd like to invite you to talk about the media in particular.
Certainly. I think there's an important debate to be had about the way the media tackles and covers and facilitates elections, because the media has a critical role in the process at a number of levels. So that is something to watch carefully. You know, it strikes me that that this election is not about policy, in the sense that we don't see a policy debate. We don't see a focus on policy statements. It's about people, and it's about governance, and it's about leadership. But there's very little debate about actual policy. And I think that's a media weakness, just as an example, that the media should be paying much more attention to making people look at and address and think about the important policy issues we face. Not that other issues like governance and leadership are not important, but they're a bit hollow without policy as well. But we have a particular concern. I personally have a particular concern and fear for potential online interference in our elections. And I think there's not sufficient awareness around the capability of certain, for example, certain governments, foreign interests, who have interests in South Africa and alliances in South Africa, and who have a record and reputation for interfering in elections in the West, in particular in the US and Europe and the UK, for example. So that is something I think that needs to be watched, and we need to be very aware of, as an example. And I think the possibility there is of tying up with elements in South Africa who have in the past and who will continue to use social media to spread disinformation, rumor, slander, all the tools available to try and twist an election, and which is so enabled by social media, and in particular, artificial intelligence, the ability to create videos that show people saying things they never said convincingly. We've already seen one or two examples of that, and that's something to be very careful, very aware of.
Alan, perhaps before going to the issues specifically dealing with threats on journalists, you are internet rights researcher and expert. Anything you'd add to what Anton has said about that?
No, I mean, just to, I haven't seen those examples he mentioned, and I'd be curious to look at them later. I didn't realize that it was such a threat. I mean, of course, we had during the Zuma presidency, we had the interference of the foreign companies and so on. So that clearly would be an issue to watch, and certainly misinformation is a big issue. I'm quite curious of how the political parties are going to respond to journalists during the election period, particularly groups like the EFF, but also the ANC and more conservative groups, which have generally, in many ways, excluded the media or have been quite dismissive of the media, and even members of parliament and so on, spokespeople. So the information environment in the more sort of traditional sense is also of interest to me, besides what might happen on the online layer, which clearly is something that as Anton said, needs to be paid more attention to. I was quite struck recently, and I don't actually live in South Africa, I live in Argentina, but when I went back to South Africa recently, I suddenly heard the EFF, for example, doing these quite brilliant interviews. I thought they were articulate, I thought they were interesting and so on. And I thought, what's the change? Because a few months ago, they were sort of shoving journalists to the ground and stepping over them with taxi ranks, So for me, that's interesting. It also raises a few suspicions about, is this a period where people start to use the media to cozy up to journalists, but after the elections, maybe things return to the kind of normal, if you want.
Well, just in regard to that, there's certainly a comment I've heard from people involved in local government is that generally, when it comes to local government and participation in discussion, in policy making, the EFF is prepared, it's articulate, it's clear. Something that the comment has been that the ANC has not. So that is certainly, I think, that issue, the strategy that raises the concern you raise is probably a subject all on its own. To look at the report, and particularly to start with the threats faced by journalists on assignments. You identify police, political party representatives, the public, and criminals. Can I ask Alan to just give me an idea of what sort of issues arise, and particularly with regard to the public, because ostensibly one would assume that if the public is getting exposure to its grievances and through service delivery protests, the media should be a welcome presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a complex question, and it's also relates to things like, I mean, it's a story, and one can sort of come at it at different angles. But during for example, the riots that ensued, the arrest of Jacob Zuma, there were about 5 community radio stations that were looted too. Who did the looting? I don't know, but that's some kind of indication that in some way communities don't necessarily see the media as part of their everyday struggle in life. And I think generally that's true. I mean, the media tends to, certainly the mainstream media, report from a city bias, not necessarily from a pro-poor perspective and so on. And I think this does filter down into the streets when people see journalists. There's more likely to be antagonism than a sort of a general attitude of, well, they're going to report our grievances in a way that represents us properly. I've just gone blank. I'm sorry.
Anton?
If I can add to what Alan's
Please
saying, I
do.
think it points to something that is of concern to us and something one should be looking at and thinking about. That is the fact that our media, our media naturally has certain voices which are strong and certain voices which are weaker. And a society as unequal as ours, then there are going to be some voices that don't have the same weight, presence, volume as others. And I think that's very true. And I think it affects all of our understanding of what's going on in this country. Generally the media were caught unawares when Jacob Zuma rose to the top of the ANC. And were caught unawares again to find that his party has traction, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. Why is that? It's because you do not, in most media, in most mainstream media, you're not hearing the voice of rural KZN, that constituency. We hear selected voices for various reasons, and we often have to sit up and say, hold on a minute. Why do we not hear these voices? Why do we not understand what's actually happening on the ground in KwaZulu-Natal?
Perhaps I could take it. Sorry, Alan, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, the assessment of the reporters out on assignment was done through SANEF media releases, and I think the fact that you could argue, they did show that the public inhibited free reporting significantly, and in perhaps almost as much as the police, is in itself a very significant. It was a discovery, really. And it does point to the gaps that we're talking about, as well as other issues. I mean, I think there is a fundamental not misunderstanding, but there's not necessarily a shared understanding of what freedom of expression means and the importance of it amongst the whole population, right? Which leads to, and certainly some groups appear to think that act as if they think that's not really essential to a functioning society. So that's also part of the mix, so to speak. I mean, versions of sort of conservatism and authoritarianism happen all over, in rural areas too, and not necessarily everyone thinks that free expression or the media is a good thing to have.
That obviously goes to the issue of access to the media, which is raised in your report. What I'm interested in is the general quality of the journalism that South Africa needs, and you do allude to it in the report in terms of training, resources, the fact that legacy media has by and large diminished considerably because of social media, because of the move to online. Where does that play a role in really communicating more thoroughly and widely about the issues that people like voters should be considering? Alan?
You mean the quality of the journalism you're talking about?
The quality of the journalism and the general sense that people, I suppose, harking back to the bad old days, didn't necessarily come in at some sort of basic court reporting type level and then work outwards. That there's been a lot of pressure by virtue of all the pressures on the industry, perhaps to require of journalists something that experience needs to provide but may not.
Well, I mean, I'll answer briefly, and then I think Anton is in a better position to speak to that, given his work and his history and so on. But certainly what is recognized as happening is the multimedia environment, the lack of proper professional gatekeeping, and so on. All these pressures that make journalists have to work quickly, but as well as the need for specialization. And in the South African landscape, as you'll know, some of the best journalism is coming out of NGO-funded projects, whether the Amabungani or whether Becky Sisa, or even the Daily Mavericks has some funded components to it. And if you speak to, for example, Becky Cisa around the specialization of health journalism, they tell you that good journalism takes time. It does take time. And commercial newsrooms, I'm more cynical. I think they prefer not to, budget-wise, but they don't appear to be in a position to offer that time to their journalists to report as thoroughly as we might want them to report on. But Anton, you, with the Taco Caper Awards and all that kind of stuff, have a good view of this, I think.
There's no question that the shrinkage in our newsrooms has had a dire effect on our ability to play the role that we expect journalism to play in the society. To cite one example, most of our city newspapers, like the Star or the Cape Times or the Daily News or the Pretoria News, are owned by the Independent Group, which we know is in a dire situation. And that means we're getting much less coverage of the very important role that cities are playing in service delivery in our country. We're just not getting the kind of coverage we saw previously. There's been a series of hearings at the Competition Commission into the impact of the big tech platforms, Facebook and Google and others, on our local media. And there's been a succession of the big media groups talking about how dire the situation is, really dire, how none of them are making any money. And in fact, most are losing money. And the devastating impact of these big platforms stealing the audience, stealing the advertising, and using our local news material without paying for it. So in fact, it raises critical issues about the future of our news industry, but has really served to highlight how serious that situation is.
Just to look at the issues that affect journalists. A lot of the examples that are mentioned in the report deal with threats. Some of violence, some of death, some of rape. It's extraordinary. I mean, I'm not saying unique to South Africa by any stretch, but given our social our social issues, our murder rates, our intolerance, our levels of intolerance, the rape statistics, the fact that senior journalists, experienced journalists, on the receiving end of political parties or individuals, or perhaps just the corrupt, and is it not really a reflection? It's a narrowing of the space, but it's a reflection of poor governance that's ultimately led to all of these forces being empowered, knowing that there are very few strictures. The police force in particular is neither polices events necessarily particularly well, and journalists could end up on the receiving end, but the governance in general on issues. It is the Wild West, as you previously described, Anton.
You're quite right. In a society with such crime and violence, inevitably that affects people's capacity to express themselves. And yes, it means that people can threaten and harass and make difficult the lives and work of journalists without much fear of retribution. But it also means that, for example, whistleblowers are particularly vulnerable because they get insufficient protection from the law and the institutions that should protect people like whistleblowers, the justice system, the police, etc. What that points to, as Alan highlights in his report, is the gap between policy on our freedoms and reality in a society of violence and crime and inequality.
It strikes me that these are obviously all actions that would very naturally have a negative effect on the individual in all sorts of ways. But it also gives succor to, particularly one thinks of a party like the EFF, who, as you say, trades in this sort of dichotomy between thuggish, unabashed threat on the one hand, and this articulate, clear, almost sophisticated approach on the other. So, in other words, I think my broader question is: are many of these issues not about ultimately changing? You have to change the governance of this country has to change, because it's very much a reflection of what we've been through since the days of Jacob Zuma and carrying on into the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa. It's a defensiveness. It's being faced with an aggressive media that keeps probing. Everything comes to light. The Zondo Commission was probably really the apex of it in the public eye, and yet it's not salutary for those who drive the policy and write the legislation.
Well,
You mean that? Go ahead.
Here you go, Alan.
No, I just wanted to clarify. You mean those sort of things like the Zondo Commission don't move into legislation? That legislation just carries on in the way it was done before.
It's not just legislation, which I think has been highlighted as cutting, as potentially minimizing rights. The GILA bill, the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill, the hate speech bill, etc. It's that sense that what you can't control by governing well, you'll govern by legislation, by diktat.
Right.
Anton,
I mean, I think you
mentioned in the report how much firefighting you're essentially doing to cover that.
I mean, that's what we find. We find ourselves all the time responding to unexpected things that pop up all over the place that affect freedom of expression. And you point to something very important, which is that our institutions of accountability were gravely weakened in the Zuma era and have not really yet been properly rebuilt. So that means that if you're not held accountable for things that you do, then you're more likely, for example, to be corrupt, to attack journalists, to threaten others, to assassinate your rivals, because you know that the chances of being held accountable for it are not that great. So there's no question that fundamental to protecting free expression and freedom of movement and everything that goes with it, the right to protest, lies the need for better governance, for the rebuilding of the institutions of justice and accountability that shape our society.
Can I look at an issue that again would make sense once is brought to our attention, but is covert by its very nature, and that is, Alan, the surveillance of journalists.
I mean, that's it's one of those things that it's very difficult to prove almost, and so often journalists will confidently report that they believe they're being surveilled, and I think we should take them at their at the face value when they say that, because they have ways of telling. But of course, Amabungani brought the constitutional court case and got RICA overturned, at least temporarily sent back for review. And there were several cases of clearly provable surveillance included in the application. It's undoubtedly goes on. I mean, I don't think there's a government in the world at the moment that doesn't surveil using technology. And I suppose from a sort of secure CAT's perspective, some of it is necessary, and I guess for state security, some of it is necessary. But it's how you do about it, what the checks or balances are, who's involved in the decision making, and these are very, very important aspects. I'm not sure if journalists should never be surveilled. I mean, I haven't thought through it to that extent, but certainly at the moment, surveillance in South Africa is being used effectively as a tool to control, not to keep people safe, based on the constitutional rights. I would say that's probably a true statement.
Anton, intriguing was something, again, one wouldn't necessarily have thought about, and that is access to government sources. I would think that the greater the access, the more reliable the information, both because of the government sources will expect they will be grilled on issues, but also that they can be put to other people for comment or opposition or whatever the position may be, and really air issues properly, and perhaps give, without realizing it, the government's losing opportunities to put a decent case forward just by virtue of, perhaps is it professionalism, is it tactic, is it incompetence, some of the above, all of the above?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I think our government communication is generally quite poor, and it stems from an attitude towards the media and a defensiveness towards the media, and the media, of course, often represents the public in these encounters with politicians. So that's a lot of what it's about, a defensiveness in coming face to face with the electorate. It starts at the very top with the president, who's given very few interviews in his 5-year term, and who, when he holds press conferences, takes few or no questions. And a critical element of accountability is for a president to stand before the media as representatives of the public, to face questions, and to answer for him or herself and the government. Another way in which we see a kind of contempt for the media and for public interest is in our access to government information. You will know that there's a law we call PIA, Promotion of Access to Information. It's quite a good law. It's not without its faults, but it's a pretty good law. I've tried to use it a number of times, and unless, most times one gets no answer at all. One's got to be prepared to go all the way to the courts, generally, to get them to respond, to reveal information which we are entitled to by law, and which is critical to accountability. Very often you can't hold, for example, people accountable for water supply or electricity if you don't have the information. Government has that information and is often contemptuous of attempts to get for the media to get hold of it, or for experts to get hold of it, in order to understand the situation better. And as I say, I think that begins at the top, but it filters through all elements of government.
Alan, does that not speak to a gap where you've got a media that is emboldened to perform its function within limitations? In other words, to bring out into the open what we should be able to hear, and a government that's playing catch up and, pardon all my mixing of metaphors, kicking things into touch because they don't know how to respond to being exposed. There's almost, one would almost imagine that by now they would expect it, and yet in so many respects at all levels of government, and we've seen it particularly in health issues, we see it at municipal level all the time. The government just isn't really in the game because it's not applying the sort of principles of governance that we expect and deserve.
I mean, I think that there's probably multiple reasons for that. One is criminality, corruption. So, and people are hiding corruption, whether in a party, I mean parties generally, or in individuals are hiding their own actions. And another one is a sort of there's time involved. I mean, to be transparent takes time and commitment, but it speaks to a commitment to that. So there's a lack of commitment, really. It is probably also an element of this, and power. If a low-level bureaucrat or a lower-level bureaucrat, I don't mean that disparagingly, does not want to share information, there's power issues involved there. So all of these work together. But exactly that is that if you don't have, the other thing about the public attitudes to the media is when they see the leaders, the MPs and the president and so on, being disparaging towards the journalists. Of course, they will assume that's an okay attitude, and that happens a lot. So I mean, these are all elements that happen altogether. I mean, as far as I understand, for instance, the open government movement has more or less faded away, and it's starting to come back again. But none of it is sort of like it was the spirit of say the '94 when the liberation movement and the ANC in that case came into power with these very strong freedoms positions, from the Freedom Charter and the Constitution, and a lot of good legislation was shaped then. But that showed a sort of a commitment of spirit, really, from the people involved, and that really is the complete opposite. Seems evident right now. I mean, in fact, it's hard to find sort of a political party that feels committed to rights as a fundamental part of their election manifesto, in an outspoken way, I mean, from my perspective anyway.
Anton, let's look at it from the point of view of the report talking about the accessing the courts. Now, here one is perhaps taking a leaf out of the Jacob Zuma playbook in Stalingrad Tactics, which imply expense. And I think the general rule is that the guys seeking to hide the information are going to have resources that cannot be matched by the journalists as individuals or the media houses that they work for. And so what you can't necessarily achieve in a variety of other ways, or assassination may not be a good look, putting that pressure, both financial and emotional, is an extraordinarily good strategy for getting the media off your back.
Yes, there's no question that one has to say, in talking about the role of the courts in this, one has to say first of all that the courts, particularly the higher courts, have been very good in defending access to information in general, access to information and protection of free expression. There's no question that they've been incredibly important in doing that. But it does take huge resources to get it to the higher courts, particularly when you see the working of our lower courts is such that the Stalingrad approach, if you have the resources to do it, is quite effective. It can be very effective. So the capacity of ordinary people or freelance journalists who don't have big institutions behind them to protect themselves or assert their rights in the courts is limited, particularly in relation to government. So that is an ongoing worry and concern. Fortunately, there are some philanthropists and foundations who give support to those who want to use the courts, and I think that's very important as well.
Just on that, is there more that the formal media industry can do to perhaps to show support, if possibly if not financial, then at least show very strong and principled support that we as the public can see that it's out there, because very often we only catch up with it much later. And perhaps the issue of Karen Morn and Billy Downer have most recently brought it to the fore. But it's the sense that very often the media itself could make more of it from a point of view of getting the public on side.
Well, let me say that I think around Karen Morn's prosecution by Jacob Zuma, that private prosecution and that particular thing, the media, by and large, came to her defense and made a big noise about it. So there are times when the media does respond, and it has, I think, the appropriate effect on public opinion. I mean, the notable exception, of course, is the Rogue Independent Group, which we've mentioned already. But by and large, the support for Karen, as an example, has been very good. And it's an absolutely critical element. The one is, when there is an attack on free expression, particularly against journalists, that the media as a whole must all rush forward. And we do it sometimes, not enough. But you're quite right that what needs to be done is not just not just to be a media issue, but to be a popular public issue. And quite often we don't do enough to get the public on side on issues of free expression and free media.
Alan, I see you agreeing.
I was just thinking of sort of around the field of internet rights, and certainly what the COVID period showed, that there was a greater awareness amongst the public around issues of privacy and what happens to their data and am I being surveilled and that kind of thing. A more general awareness, which is largely absent. And I do, in a sense, not blame the media, but I do think the media could do a better job of reporting from a rights-based perspective, from a human rights-based perspective on all sorts of issues. Things are not controversies just because they're controversies, but because they involve fundamental rights that are everyone's rights. And I think that would help to raise a sense of that amongst citizens, that they actually do have rights, which is really that's the objective, right? Which requires a whole systemic kind of response in a sense. But I think the media could do perhaps a stronger, more work at that level, whether it's through something like the Karen Morn event issue, or COVID and privacy issues and so
on. Just to move away from the media, it's because it's an obvious focus, and the ramifications are huge for society in general. But just to look at some of the issues you discuss fairly briefly, but in the broader context. Alan, regarding just the issue of targeted killings, and this is not about targets being put on the backs of the media, but on people in all sorts of, whether it be in the taxi industry or the construction industry or political assassinations, etc., etc. It makes sense, but as I say, one wouldn't necessarily associate it with the actual issue of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Can you just flesh that out a little?
Well, look. I mean, first of all, the statistics are somewhat horrifying. I mean, but a period of 2 years, 276 targeted killings identified through one index that maps these, and it's more than Pakistan. It's more than I'm sorry, more than India and more than Brazil. And of course, the population sizes aren't even comparable, and half of Mexico. Where crime-related and political assassinations are common. And that's not just a prejudice. I actually asked the Mexican, is that a prejudicial view of Mexico? He said, no, that's exactly what it is. So South Africa is, in a sense, that is an unrecognized kind of threat to freedoms generally. And some of them are about people speaking out. Some of them are political killings where you can assume there's freedom of expression involved and so on. So not all of them are. but certainly some of them are. And also, as Anton can explain more, but he found in one of his awards, there was, I think there was a Henry Nkumalo grant or something like that. I think, yeah, one of the journalists came back and said she didn't want to accept it anymore because she was going to report on some investigative journalism, but she felt that it was unsafe for herself and I think her family, because this general sort of environment of very real threats to your personal safety that has emerged. And in terms of threats to freedom of expression, I mean, we can make further links, but I mean, in many countries now, we're seeing how organized crime is starting to infiltrate the political system. And I mean, in Ecuador, they invaded the state, one of the broadcast, I think it was the state broadcasters, and took over, the broadcasting. I mean, there's an interesting link to freedom of expression. We're not there, but the impact of organized crime on freedom of expression is potentially very dangerous. And my guess is it's going to get worse. I can't see it getting better in the future in South Africa.
So let me add to the example you gave, because it goes further than Alan has talked about. So a fund that I run gave out 3 grants to journalists to investigate the construction mafia. We know it's important. We know it's fundamentally affecting our industry and our economy, and it needs more attention. So we gave grants to 3 journalists to investigate. One, as Alan has said, took one look and said, "This is too dangerous. I'm sorry. My family won't let me proceed, and here's your money back." A second one got well into the story in a small town area with incredible courage. But at a certain point, we had to come in. We had to bring in a security specialist. We had to increase his security at his home because of the threats he was getting from the local construction mafia. And he was incredibly courageous, but there's no doubt that it has a chilling effect on our capacity and willingness to cover these absolutely critical issues. And I think that's a very good example of how it can shut down coverage.
Well, and one of the issues around, sorry, if I could just add quickly, one of the issues around that is actually what happens in the local and rural areas, where I think it becomes even more of a direct threat to, for example, environmental activists and so on.
Yeah. Sorry, Anton, it looks like Alan has frozen. So I'm going to just move the conversation just because
sorry,
carry on, Alan.
I just stopped talking. Sorry, that was the end of my sentence. Sorry, and then I froze.
Given the time constraints, I would just like to cover a couple of areas and then just mention the areas that are covered by the report, but we can't begin, to unpack. And the one is the right to protest. Now, you raised the point about the legislation of old requiring permission to protest and an undue reliance in the government on that permission in order to help it control potential violence. I'm concerned that I think you mentioned that the legislations used to say sort of 15 people or more. I certainly think that there is a need for permission, and it probably should be granted only in the event of something much larger. And that's not because of, per se, inhibiting the right to protest, but to balance rights in society where protest, even if it's not violent, can become very disruptive to a whole lot of the expression of other rights by people who are not involved in the process by virtue of the protests happening. Am I being a little bit too sort of rigid on that, or too process oriented on that? Or is that really what something like that should speak to, is the practicalities of having a level of disruption, which is obviously what protest is about, but not so undue that, perhaps to use the example of Just Stop Oil in the UK, of gluing yourselves to the highways.
Yeah,
Anton?
that's,
Sorry.
I'm not a protest legislative expert, of course, but I did look at it in the report, and obviously there's a difference between calls for stopping work and staying at home and protest. They're not necessarily the same thing, for example. But my view is it's more dangerous to limit protests so that it doesn't disrupt than to allow the protest to disrupt. I think by the very nature protests should disrupt. That's excluding violence and so on, and excluding burning down. That's something different. Um, but so I would say that I agree. You need to balance people's rights and so on. But I think there is space for some disruption allowed. Although I do get your point. But I think it's in the very nature of protest, right? That it's going to disrupt some kind of ordinary events of the day.
Anton,
Well,
is there done?
we need we need to develop a sense of what's acceptable and not acceptable. Alan makes an important point in saying that protest is always somewhat disruptive. That's the point of protest, to disrupt daily life. But what we don't have across our society is an acceptance that violence, burning, and activities like that are quite unacceptable. And the only way you achieve those rules, I think, is not by requiring people to register and get permission to protest, because I think that just makes people more frustrated. But with effective policing, and a consistency in saying these are the rules, and the minute you cross those rules, you're going to end up in court. But at the same time, the police will protect your right to protest short of that kind of activity. There seems to be too much inconsistency and look, we must understand that these things happen for various reasons, but one of them is because there's a high level of frustration around the lack of response from the authorities. So, of course, the most important thing is to show a response in various ways to when people are upset and angry.
I think,
yeah. If I could just quickly add to that, and we need to remember that this is South Africa, where a significant portion of the population is either through language, through not having access to the internet, to not having access to the media, is excluded from the public conversation. And of course, the protest has traditionally, effectively, been an important part of that expression. So, rather than the municipality starting to want to charge for policing and so on, the state should consider education and awareness raising programs. And I know everyone's short of money, but there should be budgets to allow that, because it's the same reason why the state broadcast is funded. There should be a budget for municipalities to divide policing and all that kind of stuff for protests. They should facilitate protests as opposed to cutting them down, I think. Yeah.
In fact, I don't think there's much disagreement between us, because it's not the right to protest as such. It's practicalities of marrying the right to protest with other rights, freedom of trade, right to trade, etc. So it's really about process, and if the authorities and potential protesters can become secure that it's not the what, it's the how that's really at issue. And just to perhaps largely specifically deal on, and that is disinformation and misinformation. This has got to be a global issue. We're not in a category of our own on this. It's a crisis the world faces. Anton, is there something specific about the South African environment that makes us different to the plethora of complaints one hears about in the West?
Well, disinformation spreads where journalism and traditional media and trustworthy sources are weak, because the best counter to disinformation is good information. So when our media is weak and our journalism suffers from the things we've been talking about earlier, that opens the door to disinformation. There's no question. But I do think that we have to debate making those who carry disinformation more accountable for what they carry. You know, the fundamental reason for the spread of disinformation is that platforms like Facebook and X do not have the same rules that the traditional media has. If what we carry in a newspaper or a radio station or a television station, we are accountable for. So if we carry disinformation, we have to account for that, and can be held responsible for that. There's a problem in the fact that the big platforms are not held accountable except through political pressure, which means they've taken some steps, but only just enough steps to try and relieve that pressure. But I think the root of the issue we have to face up to is the need to get the platforms to take responsibility for their impact on society, and that is through their content.
And also, exactly, that disinformation, as Anton is suggesting, flourishes in particular environments. If you have a strong media that is factually based, that does good reporting, you will find that you won't stop disinformation. And there's different versions of different information, right? There's deliberate sort of strategic attempts to influence, and there's sort of like stuff, nonsense news passed around. But it also goes towards sort of the culture of the quality and culture of data and information that the government has. So it becomes systemic in that way, as well as openness and accountability. You know, I mean, we talked about PIA earlier. So these are the structural things that can mitigate and lessen the impact of disinformation that need attention. I mean, you know, and I know Anton agrees, legislating against disinformation is extremely problematic because it opens all sorts of doors for increased censorship by governments and relies too much on the goodwill of those governments, most of the legislation, because of the vague wording and so on.
Okay. Well, I think we probably need to have dedicated discussions about some of these specifics, but just to mention that some of the issues you raise are the effect of gender and sexual identity on freedom of expression. So it's very much, that's an issue about, by and for women. The freedom of expression in the arts, and we haven't really had the opportunity at this stage to look at developments in policy and legislation, but there's certainly lots of opportunity to consider those issues in more detail. I will put the on this interview, I will make sure that the access to the report, if you're keen for it to get out, will be on the released interviews. And all I can say is thank you for sort of delving into an area that is obvious and yet so not obvious in so many ways, and really is pause for thought, and pause for thought in the fact that there is nothing in society and no element of society and problems in society that don't impact upon our rights in ways that are very, very sobering. The good news, do we have any?
Yes, we do. We do. I mean, we still have a great deal of free expression. You and I can denounce the president in the most tough terms, call him a crook and a useless prevaricator, and we can call him corrupt if we want. We are not in danger of going to prison or being arrested. As we've indicated, there are signs that one would come under pressure and worrying pressure. But I think the main thing to celebrate is that our courts have defended that space. The higher courts have by and large defended that space, and that's been absolutely critical.
Alan?
And it seems that our protest laws are much better than, for example, the ones currently in the UK, for example. So there is a lot to celebrate. Yeah.
Perhaps if I could just add in by adding that I think one of the things South Africa has that is extraordinary, perhaps in the context of the country, of our history, is a civil society that is robust in the extreme and broad. And I think we could be, in that respect, and organizations like the ones you represent are really what's part of what makes any threats a sense that our corner is being fought for and you're in our corner, and that may be invaluable, absolutely invaluable to our society. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad we got the other opportunity, and I will no doubt prevail upon both of you to drill down on shorter specific interviews for in the future as the need arises, which should be about this time next week at the very latest. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
And to those who've been watching, let's celebrate while we proceed with a huge amount of caution and skepticism and demand of the governance and the governors of the society that they serve the people do not serve them. So if you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll look forward to any future events that we will hold. Thank you and goodbye.